All right, so now that we've graphed quadratic equations and we know that it's a u, now we're going to talk about quadratic inequalities. And so when you guys graphed linear inequalities, you would graph the two lines and figure out which area to shade. This is going to be similar, except for because we know that quadratic will hit your x-axis usually at 2 points, we can figure out the shading on a number line instead of doing the whole entire u. And so if we can find the zeros of the quadratic, then we can find out where or which intervals are true for the inequality. So a couple of things. The very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to find the zeros. And we can do that a couple different ways. The easiest way to do that is factor. So best case scenario, we're going to factor. So easiest way is factoring. So that's using the box, which we've been using since the beginning of the year. And the second way, or another way, I should say, is we can do quadratic formula. And quadratic formula, remember, is x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And again, I would say you should factor if you can, because that's easier. But if not, then we're going to find our zeros by doing quadratic formula. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to graph the zeros on the number line. And a couple things with that, I guess I can just do a period. So a couple things to remember with that is if it's greater than or less than, then it's an open circle. If it's greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, then it's a closed circle. And what I mean by that is open circle, closed circle. Okay, it's colored in. The third thing we're going to do is we're going to find the intervals which are true. And I'm going to show you, there's a way for you to pick a point and figure it out that way, but it's also, and I should say interval or intervals, it might just be one. Okay, that are true for the inequality. We're going to have to squeeze that in. All right. So there's one way for you to pick a point and plug it into your equation, find out if it's true or false. There's another way where you can just think of a number line and think of if it's a 0, to the left is positive, to the right is negative, and that's probably the easiest way. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to write our interval notation or intervals solutions. Okay, which means which points make my equation true. And again, there's a couple ways for us to write that. We're going to write it in interval notation because that's the easiest. So as we look, the very first thing we're going to do, and this is what I always do, is look to see if you can actually factor it. So remember, we do a times c. So I'm going to take it over to the side. I get -2. Our factors of -2 are 1 and 2. Is there any way for me to get a 1 in the middle? And there is. If I want a positive 1. So 2 minus 1 gives me positive 1. And so now we're going to do our box method. And again, we've been doing this for quite a while. So remember, our first term goes in the first box. Our last term goes in the last box. And the pair that we pick goes in the other two boxes. So we have -1x and we have 2x. And now we're going to just factor out the greatest common factor. So when I look at this one, I look at what's the greatest common factor out of this row. So they both have an x. I look at the last row and I say, well, what goes into 2 and -2? What's the greatest common factor? That would be 2. Look at the first column, what goes into x squared and 2x? X. Look at the second column, what divides evenly into -1 and -2? It would be -1. Now, again, we could always check and make sure you're good. Like, let's pretend you missed that sign. And you said, well, 1 goes into both of them. If I check it, I go x times x is x squared, checks out. Is x times 1 negative 1x? That doesn't check out, and so that helps me see that I forgot my negative. It's a really good idea to check. 2 times x is 2x, 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. So because everything checks out, we're going to take those factors and set them equal to 0, which again, this is all review. We've already done this before. So we set them equal to 0, we solve. So we add 1 to both sides. We get x is equal to 1. We subtract 2 from both sides, and we get x is equal to negative 2. Now these are our values, or our zeros, for this equation. So now what we're going to do is we look at our inequality sign. So when I look at my inequality sign, it is a less than, which means it is an open circle. So I'm going to put an open circle on 1 and an open circle on negative 2. Now notice I have no numbers on my number line. So that means you need to decide how you're going to do your number line. So when I look at it, I'm going to say this is 0. And because my numbers are fairly small, I might go every other one. So here's 1, here's 2, here's 3. And then on the other side, I'm going to go, here's negative 1, here's negative 2, here's negative 3. Okay, so here's 1, 2, 3, 0, and then every other one, just so that I can see where it's at. So now I'm going to graph those as open circles. So I'm going to have an open circle at 1, and I'm going to have an open circle at negative 2. And basically what that does is it divides my number line into 3 sections. So I'm just going to kind of make it a little dash line here. Okay, so I've got this section and this section. So the way I usually look at it is I look to see if negative 2 is a 0. So if we think of that circle as a 0, then to the left of zeros on a number line, we've got to the left, which is a negative, and everything to the right is positive. Now, if 1 is our 0, if we pretend 1 is 0, then everything to the left is negative. Everything to the right is positive. And now we're multiplying, because remember our factors are multiplied. So a negative times a negative is a positive in this region. A negative times a positive is a negative in the middle region. And a positive times a positive is a positive in the outer region. Now, when I go back to my inequality sign, this inequality says less than. Okay, so we want it less than 0. So what numbers are less than 0? Positive numbers or negative numbers? Well, negative numbers are. So that means it's this region that's shaded in. And so my solution then would be, because it's open, it would be from negative 2, comma, 1, and parentheses because it's open. If it's closed, that is its bracket. If you think back to what you did in secondary 1. When I look at example 2, same idea. Very first thing I'm going to do is factor if I can. So I first look, is there a greatest common factor? Nope. So now you're going to go first times last, which is 16. I look to see if there's, not 16, sorry, 3 times 5 is 15. I look for factors of 15 that give me 16. So 1 times 15 will give me 16, and I need it to be a negative 16, so both of these are negatives. So I'm going to do my box. So again, with my box, I put the first number in the first box. I put the last number, which is 5, in the last box. The pair that I picked goes in the other 2 boxes. So I've got negative 1x and negative 15x. And remember, those don't matter where they go. And we're going to do the same thing. We take out the greatest common factor. So the greatest common factor of the first row is 3x. Greatest common factor of my last row is negative 1. Greatest common factor of my first column is x. Greatest common factor of my second column is 5. And the first number is a negative, so this should be a negative. And then we just want to make sure we double check. So we've got 3x times x is 3x squared. 3x times negative 5, negative 15x. Negative 1 times x, negative 1x, and negative 1 times negative 5 is positive 5. So everything checks out. So now we're going to take our factors. So x minus 5 equals 0 and 3x minus 1 equals 0, and we're going to solve. And again, we just solve like a normal problem. So the way we get rid of minusing 5 is we add 5. So we get x is equal to 5. And over here, it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to add 1. So we get 3x is equal to 1, but now we're going to be dividing by 3. And so we're going to get x is equal to 1/3. That's a little bit harder to graph. But because you don't have lines on your graph, I'm going to just do this a little bit different. My numbers are positive, so I'm going to say this is 0. And then if I break it down in thirds, 1, 2, so 1/3, 2/3, 3/3, 3/3, this is 1. So this is 2, this is 3, 4, so every 3, 5, 6, okay? So now when I go to graph it, I'm going to look at my values again. So as I go back to here, this is a less than, so this is less than or equal to. And because you have that or equal to part, that means it's going to be a closed circle. So we're going to put closed circles on 1/3, which would be here, and at 5, which would be here. And again, that divides my interval, or my number line, I should say, into 3 intervals. So again, if the 1/3 is a 0, so if this is really a 0, then to the left is negative and to the right is positive. If 5 is really our 0, so if we pretend 5 is a 0, then to the left is negative, to the right is positive. A negative times a negative is a positive, a negative times a positive is a negative, and a positive times a positive is a positive. And again, we're doing less than. So less than numbers, if it's less than 0, that means it has to be negative. And so it would be this region in between. And so I would say that my values are going to be, and again, because it's closed circle, it's going to be a bracket. So it's going to go 1/3, 5 bracket. All right. Example 3, I'm going to change because all of our problems are less than problems. So I'm going to change this to a greater than. So if you guys could do that really quick, change it to a greater than problem. And then kind of the same idea. We're going to go, notice this time it's not set equal to 0. So I do have one extra step. I need to move that over first. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So I get x squared minus 4x plus 3 is greater than or equal to 0. I have to do that before I can do anything else. Now I'm doing the same thing. I'm going to go 1 times 3 is 3, and our factors of 3 are 1 and 3. Is there any way for me to get a negative 4? There is. If I make both of these negatives, I can get a negative 4. So we're going to do our box and then go from there. So our first term is our first box is our first term. So this is going to be x squared. Our last term is our 3. And then the pair that I picked was negative 1x and negative 3x. And we're going to take out our greatest common factor. So greatest common factor is x. Greatest common factor is 3. Greatest common factor is x. Greatest common factor is 1. And as we look, is x times x squared? Yeah, but is x times 1 negative 1x? Nope, we needed a negative sign there. Is 3 times x negative 3x? Nope, we need a negative 3 there. Is negative 3 times negative 1 a positive 3? Yep, so everything checks out. So we're going to set them equal to 0. And again, we're just going to solve like we normally would. So we're going to add 1 to both sides. So we get x is equal to 1. We'll add 3 to both sides to get x is equal to 3. And so we get our numbers. This time as I look, because I changed it, remember, and we can even go to here, this is a greater than or equal to sign. So that means they're going to be closed circles. And so when I go to graph, I'm just going to say, we'll just say this is Say this is 0. And I'm just going to do every other one just to give us a little bit of space. So if I was going to graph these, notice that they're going to be closed circles. So I have a closed circle at 1, and I have a closed circle at 3. And then again, it's the same idea. If this is where it's dividing my intervals. So I'm again saying if 1 is a 0, if 1 is really, the whole idea is like these are zeros. So 1 is 0, which means everything to the left is negative, everything to the right is positive. And if 3 is 0, then everything to the left is negative, everything to the right is positive. And so negative times a negative is a positive times a positive, a negative, positive times a positive is a positive. And this time I want greater than or equal to, which means I want it bigger than 0, and the numbers bigger than 0 are positives. So that means it's going to be the values this way and the values this way. And so if I was going to write the interval solution, I would go negative infinity to 1. And because 1 is a closed circle, it's going to be a bracket, union, bracket, 3, because 3 is a closed circle, to infinity. And this would be my solution. All right, flip your paper over. So on the back, same idea. Very first situation, we're going to see, can I take something out because I have something other than a 1? So is there a number that goes into 2, 8, and 5? There's not. So now we're going to try to factor. So we go 2 times 5 is 10. Our factors of 10 are 1 and 10 or 2 and 5. Do any of those pairs give me an 8 in the middle? Nope. This is a no. Okay, so nothing works. And if nothing works, then I have to do quadratic formula. And so remember with quadratic, this is A, this is B, this is C. So we're going to go, again, I'm going to write this up here for you. X is equal to negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. We did this right before Christmas. So hopefully you remember it. So you have X is equal to, we do negative B, so negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A. And remember that we always do what's under the square root sign first. So this is negative 8 plus or minus. We're going to put that part in the calculator. And we're just going to go 8 squared, just like this, minus 4 times 2 times 5. And if we plug it in our calculator, we're going to get 24. Now, because we're going to use this to graph actual points, I'm going to write this as a decimal. And so I want to figure out what these are as decimals instead of us just reducing. So we're going to have negative 8 plus root 24 over 4. And we have negative 8 minus root 24 over 4. And so I'm just going to put that in my calculator. And I would go negative 8 plus root 24 and then push enter and then divide by 4. And when I do that, this gives me negative 0.8. And then I'm going to go negative 8 minus root 24 in my calculator, push enter, then divide by 4. And this is going to give me negative 3.2. So now I have my zeros and I do the same thing. The only thing that I would look at is I'm going to probably need to write my numbers a little bit different in order for me to graph these on my graph. So if you don't have a graph, then it's pretty easy. You just draw a line and put your numbers in. Hopefully, well, not hopefully, put the smaller one to the left and the bigger one to the right. In this case, I think we'll go by 0.2. So I'm going to say this is going to be our negative 4. And then it's going to be, if I say this would be 3.6 or 3.8, 3.6, 3.4, 3.2, this will be negative 3. And then I'm going to go same thing. I'm going to go 4 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. This is negative 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is negative 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is 0. And I'm going to just put my points in at negative 0.8, which is going to be, let's see, 0, 2, wait, that's not 0. I lied. 0 is going to be the very end. So if I go to put my points in, I'm at negative 0.8 and I'm at negative 3.2. And they're open circles because it's a less than problem. And then the same thing, these are my dash marks. And so I'm going to say, again, if I go to the left, I'm going to go to the right. Give me 1 second. Hey, Zach. Hey, give me 1 second, okay? Hey, can you talk to Zach for just a minute until I get done? Sorry, my son's calling from his mission, so I just want to. Okay, so I'm going to just have you finish that really quick. So as we look at those points, we're just looking at, again, if that negative 3.2 is a 0, then to the left is negative, to the right is positive. And then same thing, if I'm at negative 0.8 is my 0, to the left is negative, to the right is positive. So a negative times a negative is a positive times a positive is a negative, a positive times a positive is a positive. And again, as I look at this inequality sign, it's a less than, just a less than, so it's an open circle, which we already wrote down. And then if it's less than 0, then we want the negative area, which is the value in between. So we're going to say our interval is going to be parentheses negative 3.2 union negative 0.8. We're going to look at example 5 the same way. I'm going to have us flip it so it's a greater than or equal to problem again. And then notice that it's not set equal to 0, so we're going to add 2 to both sides. So we get x squared plus 10x plus 8 is greater than or equal to 0. And again, we first try to graph it. Or first try to factor it. So we're going to go 1 times 8 is 8. Our factors of 8 are 1 and 8, or 2 and 4. And we're trying to get 10. And none of them give us a 10, so this is a big no, which means we have to do quadratic again. And so we're going to go x is equal to, and again, as we think about this, remember this is A, this is B, this is C. And so we're going to go negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A. And so as I do that, I get negative 10 plus or minus. I'm going to put those values in, okay? So I put what's underneath the radical into the calculator and I get 68. And then we're going to divide the whole thing by 2 times 1, which is 2. And so again, this breaks down into 2 problems. I've got negative 10 plus root 68 divided by 2, which is negative 0.9. And then you have negative 10 minus root 68 divided by 2. Okay, remember plus and minus. Remember to do the top before you divide. Okay, and then this is negative 9.1. So kind of the same idea. We're going to graph these. They're both negatives. So if we say, we're probably going to need to go by 2's again. So we're going to say that this is 0. Well, maybe we'll do this negative 1. So 0, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, negative 6, negative 7, negative 8, negative 9, negative 10. So as I'm putting those values in, now because it's greater than or equal to, this is going to be greater than greater than or equal to. So that means it's going to be close. So we're going to have a closed circle at negative 9.1, which is about here. And we're going to have a closed circle at negative 0.9, which is about here. And again, it divides it just like we did before. And we're doing the same thing. If this is a 0, to the left is negative, to the right is positive. If negative 0.9 is a 0, to the left is negative, to the right is positive. So negative times a negative, positive, negative times a positive, negative, positive times a positive, positive. And I want greater than, so I want bigger than 0, which is our positives. And so when I write my solution then, same idea. I'm going to go negative infinity up to negative 9.1, and it will be a bracket, union, bracket, negative 0.9 to infinity. Hopefully that makes sense. Make sure you ask questions if you missed class and you weren't able to ask it in class. And that's that for 3.7. And then your assignment is a worksheet. So you should be able to find that on Canvas as well.